Her special gift? I think it was for exploiting a personality in itself faintly and endearingly bizarre. She enlarged on herself, but always with delicacy and judgment, and always with variety. Probably her greatest triumph was in Noel Coward's comedy Blithe Spirit, as Madame Arcati, the enthusiastic medium. Watching her wonderfully funny, darting and leaping movements, you couldn't imagine the role played in any other way. And when the play was made into a film, she triumphed all over again. She expressed a kind of illogical confidence. She was the character nothing could surprise. A ghost in the drawing room? What could be more delightful?
Oh, good evening. I've leant my bike up against that little bush out there. It'll be perfectly all right if no one touches it. How nice to see you, Madame Arcati.
My dear Madame Arcati.
I'm afraid I'm rather late, but I had a sudden presentiment that I was going to have a puncture, so I went back to fetch my pump. And then, of course, I didn't have a puncture at all.
Well, perhaps you will on the way home. Would you like a cocktail?
If it's a dry martini, yes. If it's a concoction, no. Experience has taught me to be very wary of concoctions.
It is a dry martini.
How delicious. Cheers, cheers.
The cocktail of Coward's writing and story and Margaret's timing is exquisite. The fact that the film is still readily available to rent or stream or savour on good old-fashioned DVD is testament to its classic simplicity. Margaret hesitated, however, before taking the part, a clue to her character perhaps, in that her first thought was for professional mediums, a small percentage of whom she genuinely believed to be genuinely genuine.
I never to this day quite know if she was throwing herself into the part or whether she really did believe in it.
Blithe Spirit's director David Lean hints there at Margaret's willingness to embrace the other side, but also highlights something intriguing. At least occasionally one has the impression of gentle satire being so gentle and so slight as to be almost negligible. So is she sincere or is it sent up? I refer you here to a 1956 monograph in which Eric Keown, her comic effects spring not from calculated distortion, but from the eager warmth with which she embraces eccentricity.
Yes, one could indeed, but I always remember she was inclined to go over the top, you know, and I remember a scene in Blithe Spirit in which she had to eat some sandwiches. And we had a rehearsal, and she picked cucumber sandwiches, I think they were, up, and sorry, and I said, look, Margaret, I think a little less. Anyhow, in about 10 minutes, we broke for lunch, and we went into the restaurant, and I happened to look across the restaurant, and there she was eating sandwiches in exactly the same way.
I think she was rather an over-the-top person anyway, wasn't she?
Oh, she was vastly over the top and absolutely a dear, dear person.
Blithe Spirit, I think, was the first big film she did, and it was colour, and in those days the lights were very hot, which she wouldn't have liked very much. And she wasn't too clued up, so when they said action, she just sort of charged. I mean, I think she charged before they said action. Joyce Carey, who was also in it, told me this. And her first scene, in the end, they had to tie some string round her and hold her back, as with a horse on reins, to stop her being past the camera before it had got going.
David Lean also spoke about her ability to embrace the character and inhabit it, or vice versa, when he was asked in 1985 by Marjorie Bilbo if one could direct Margaret Rutherford, or was it a case of pointing the camera and letting her rip? Perhaps, as Margaret's good friend and one-time understudy, Damaris Hayman, famously suggests, her exuberance may be put down to her inexperience on set. Margaret was a late developer, and success a long time coming, as her extended family were all too aware, one of whom now explains how they are related to Margaret, the Right Honourable Tony Benn.
My great-grandfather was a congregational minister in East London, and he had a son called William Rutherford Ben and another son called John Ben, and John Ben was my grandfather, and William Rutherford Ben was the father of Margaret Rutherford. She's a very, very sweet woman. I liked her. And she was then, I suppose, in her late 20s, early 30s, and I remember being told she wanted to go on the stage, and I didn't know what that meant. She used to come to the House of Commons for family birthday parties and so on, and she always turned up, and she was always very charming, and then had to go off somewhere because she was working very hard.
We'll discover shortly that certain family circumstances did on occasion dampen Margaret's deceptively blithe spirit. Indeed, there were times when she wasn't actually blithe at all. Being unconventional was an asset as far as Margaret was concerned, as long as one had manners. There's one peculiar incident, one of many I might add, recalled here by her friend, the writer Rumer Godden. They were neighbours both living in London's Highgate, and Margaret had invited one of her co-stars to tea. It's a previously unheard private recording made to help with research on a book on Margaret, and held at Duke University, North Carolina. Poor sound quality, for which apologies.
One afternoon, when I was working in my study, I saw Margaret outside, evidently in great distress. She was wringing her hands, as she often used to do on the stage, and her face was puckered with worry. I said, "Miss Rutherford, there's something wrong. Is there anything I can do to help?" Whereupon she clasped my hands and said, "My dear, you have lived in India. You must know about monkeys. You see, I'm having a chimpanzee to tea." Now, this couldn't have happened with anybody else but Margaret. There was truth behind it. It wasn't fantasy. Well, I told her that I did know a little about monkeys. My husband used to have a pet one with whom he used to play when he was a little boy. And I warned her that the chimpanzee would probably shake hands with her, and that she must try not to shrink at the extreme coldness of a monkey's hands. Well, the chimpanzee arrived, came in through the garden door, walking hand in hand with its trainer. It was a she, and it was dressed in scarlet rompers with a scarlet heron. Margaret touched me as it approached, and just as I predicted, the chimpanzee was made to shake hands, and we got through that without any tremors. I must say the chimpanzee behaved very well, except that every now and again it used to get up and turn somersaults.
One can imagine Rutherford effortlessly composed as she is here, despite the question put to her.
Miss Rutherford, I know you have said that you detest, if that's not too strong a word, the myth of your eccentricity, including, I suppose, the kind of public image people have of you. At one time, you were thought of as a lovable old battleaxe. Are you resigned to this kind of publicity?
I'm not altogether resigned to the battleaxe. I don't mind being thought of as lovable.
Yes.
I don't mind being thought eccentric, because I like to be a person by myself, you know, with my own kind of ways. I mustn't say distinctive, but a little bit odd I don't mind being.
There are few more knowledgeable about Margaret's even temper and odd persona than Andy Merriman, author of the most recent biography, Dreadnought with Good Manners. As to his opinion on why we should find her peculiarities appealing, well, it's really quite simple.
She's a bit like sort of Tommy Cooper, I think. You know, you've only got to see them and you start smiling. She wore flowing capes. It wasn't just in Blithe Spirit when she was cycling along with the wind behind her. This is what she wore, the most ridiculous clothes that Stringer Davis, her husband, always thought she looked most elegant in. Well, if you looked at the photographs, elegant would have been the first word that would spring to mind. She didn't really seem to know what was going on outside her own little theatrical world, apart from her charity work, and she was religious too. But it was her day-to-day life, this eggs and bacon thing. She had to have eggs and bacon at the end of a performance. So the baby belling went with them wherever they were, and she would have just come off stage in the West End, and there was Stringer backstage with oil sizzling for her favourite bacon and egg.
As a double act, The two were quite comical, perhaps more off-screen than on. Stringer was also an actor, a workmanlike one, particularly in comparison to his wife. Margaret's contracts often stipulated that a part be provided for him. It's a rare instance of Margaret throwing her weight around. In turn, he was very protective of her. There is a story that during the filming of an alligator named Daisy, he stood to one side with a claw hammer concealed beneath his overcoat, just in case Daisy got out of hand. Despite appearing with Hollywood stars, British comedians, and dangerous animals, Margaret's otherwise buoyant disposition was often scuppered by bouts of unhappiness and gloom. Not particularly unusual, you might say, but it still requires a little delicacy from an interviewer when tackling such matters.
Have there been times when life wasn't so rosy?
Oh, dear me, yes. Certainly. Who could say anything but that? You see, we all of us, to get anywhere, have to climb, don't we, and work and fight for it, or it wouldn't be worth having.
Margaret did experience several pretty severe breakdowns during regular intervals, and can only be commended for the frankness with which she was able to talk about her mental health.
Miss Rutherford, you once referred to the sadness in the world and said, what I really want to do is to make the world laugh. In this, I think you're very successful. But was it your concern for the world's sadness, do you think, that led to your breakdown some years ago? Had you become saddened yourself?
Well, I think one only has a breakdown when one feels that the whole of one's object for living has gone. One has lost one's roots, one's lost one's bearings. That, I think, is almost the deepest sadness that can be imagined in the world today. And it is for that that I have the most compassion for people who are in that state. I think because I've been in that state myself.
Now, how did you emerge from this?
I emerged with the help of the Almighty, I would say, through His instruments, people round me who were anxious to give me a hand, people who were skillful, such as my doctors, people who were always at hand, such as my husband and my great friends, though I had a breakdown before ever I met him, so that I'm fairly used to them, you know. Surprised as you may be.
The reason I asked this, Miss Rutherford, is because one never expects somehow a funny person to become ill.
Don't you really? You with your intelligence.
Well said, Margaret. You just catch the flintiness in her voice, and the sadness too, at the still widespread misconception. But what may have lain behind her illness, as biographer Andy Merriman explains, is even starker.
She did suffer from a form of manic depression, bipolar disorder that we call it now. It was depression, really, which I think she does refer to as melancholia, for which she needed a rest cure. And later on was quite honest about it and had ECT, electroconvulsive treatment, for depression. But also her mania really was manifested in spending money, which is a kind of manifestation of bipolar disorder, and falling in love with anybody, but certainly in Margaret's case, the wrong people. And this is what she had to cope with for all her life, really. It was always there, and her close friends knew about it, but it was kept secret for a long, long time. Until later on, when she did have more and more breakdowns, I think probably more of a depressive nature, to the extent where she was sometimes unable to go on stage and had to be talked into going on stage. She was sat in her dressing room and doctors were sometimes there backstage to medicate her, give her injections for her to go on.
What audiences and most of her friends were unaware of were certain events in the family history which affected Margaret throughout her life. She was brought up by her Aunt Bessie, and the events concerned her parents, in particular her father, William Rutherford. As you may remember, He was the son of the Reverend Julius, Tony Benn's grandfather. As a boy, it was evident to Tony that there was some mystery surrounding his connection to this distant cousin.
Well, there was something very strange to me about Margaret Rutherford long before I knew anything about what had happened. And I used to ask my mother about her father, why was he William Rutherford and not William Rutherford Ben? And my mother said, well, it's a complicated story. And I got very curious about it. And my mother, she said, well, there's nothing to be ashamed of and everything's all right. So I went to the Times Index and I looked up the story and then I read the full account. And it is an extraordinary story.
Almost a decade before Margaret was born, within weeks of her parents' marriage, William was admitted to the Bethnal House Lunatic Asylum. He appeared to have suffered from some kind of mental breakdown. His father, the Reverend Julius, accompanied him. What happened next is what Tony Benn found out.
William Rutherford Ben had an argument with father and finally killed the Reverend Julius with a chamber pot. And he put into Broadmoor for a time and then released. Then I wondered whether she knew about it or not.
Not for some years, in fact. She was born 2 years after William's release from Broadmoor, and instead of the surname Ben, Margaret had Rutherford. The family went to India. Margaret's mother became pregnant for a second time, but was found dead, hanging from a tree in the garden. William returned home and spent the rest of his life in various psychiatric institutions, including, once again, Broadmoor.
Margaret went to live with her mother's sister, Bessie Nicholson, in Wimbledon, who was responsible for her. And she was told that her father had died. And there is a story that one day an old tramp came to the door at the house in Wimbledon and said, "Can I speak to Peg," as she was known when she was little. "I've got a message from your father. I was in Broadmoor with him. He's not dead. He's there." Well, that was the time that Margaret apparently found out that her father was still alive. And actually, interestingly, when you look at her school record, there was a period exactly at that time when she missed a lot of school.
Margaret was 12.
Maybe that was her first emotional breakdown, and that sort of set the scene for the rest of her life.
She never spoke openly about any of this, for which she can hardly be castigated. It doesn't read a mention in her autobiography. However, on the opening page, she does get her father's name wrong, and this somewhat sets the tone for the rest of the book.
As far as Margaret was concerned, she was an orphan and her parents had no effect on her life, which of course is very sad when you think of how much it did affect her throughout her life. And the spectre of mental illness, which, I think even when she wasn't ill, she had that worry that she might become ill and she might become worse and worse and end up... she was never violent herself, of course, but if your father has committed a crime like that, that must always weigh heavy on your shoulders.
I never knew until today whether Margaret herself knew about the circumstances of her father's murder of her grandfather, which we never fully understood.
Bizarre, then, that a life touched by murder should be touched by it, albeit lightly, again.
What happens when a murderer knows he's discovered, and only Miss Marple stands in his way? To meet the inimitable Margaret Rutherford is to know the indestructible Miss Marple.
Who's that? Who is it?
To meet Arthur Kennedy, Muriel Pavlo, and James Robertson Justice is to know a bestseller thriller with real-life intimacy.
I think someone in the family may be a murderer.
Ouch. Is it somewhat distasteful to accentuate the awful irony of the role that made Margaret globally famous? Amongst friends, it was clear she never wanted to take the part.
She was a bit upset to start with because there was the word murder in the title.
Damaris Hayman.
But she got over that, and I think, the financial angle probably figured. She was extremely well paid for them, I'm told.
She probably still would be. were she alive due to the continued popularity of the mighty Marple box set. 4 films in all, directed by George Pollock. According to the film critic Alexander Walker, the Marple formula was simple. With chin wagging like a windsock in an airfield and eyes that are deceptively guileless, Margaret Rutherford clumps her way through the lines, situations and disguises that would bunker an actress of less imperial aplomb.
It was a good part for Stringer, as well as her. I didn't myself like the films. I didn't think she was Miss Marple. Mind you, the scripts weren't the Miss Marple of Agatha Christie's books either. And as far as the script went, I suppose Margaret was fine, and certainly the films were very popular and still are.
Right then, time for a game of marbles. Angela Lansbury, to Hollywood. Geraldine McEwen.
There's been one Miss Marple at all, and that was Joan Hickson, who was perfect.
Yes, I completely agree, and I'm sure Margaret would too. We know that Agatha Christie would have done. That was a short game. That professional association with fictional crime never left Margaret feeling uneasy. It did not, though, deter her interest in real criminality, as David Jacobs revealed in this 1962 TV interview.
Your life is certainly not flavourless today because you spend an enormous amount of time doing a great deal of good work for people.
Oh, I don't think so.
Well,
But I have various interests.
Indeed, one of them is the Borstal Institutions for Boys,
yes.
I understand.
How funny you should. I went to see them just last week, one of their club meetings.
How did your interest in this come about?
Well, somebody wrote to me out of the blue and said that they'd decided that this club needed what they called a mum, M-U-M, because many of the lads had gone astray because they hadn't had a home background and a proper mum. They're very touching, too.
I went with her one night there to the Feltham Borstal Institution, and it was a foggy night, and we arrived late, and this was not that long before she died, so it was an awful effort. She was on sticks. We got up there and got into the room, and there was a picture of her, a huge picture on the piano, and the boys, they just converged in. You'd have thought it was Elizabeth Taylor arriving, the way they came to see her. And she would say, in a touch of great piquancy, she would say, "Oh, dear boy, have we met before?" And the boy would say, "Yes, Miss Rutherford." And she'd say, "Oh, what a pity, you're still here then. When are you going out?" And there was no self-consciousness at all. And she would just listen and nod her head and said, "Oh, yes, that was awkward that you did that. But I don't think you'll do it again, will you?" And the boys flocked round her and we moved her round. And all the way home, Margaret kept saying, "Oh, those dear boys, those dear, dear boys. I do hope I don't see them again, though." She meant, of course, the same boys.
It's difficult not to fasten on to Margaret's eagerness to be a mum. During Margaret's childhood, she had very little mumming of her own, or, of course, fathering. Yet she chose, very deliberately, the kind of people to care for.
You've taken the exceptionally extraordinary step of reading poems to prisoners in Her Majesty's jails.
Yes.
What kind of poetry did they like? What kind did you read to them, anyway?
Well, the poetry that I'm accustomed to reading. I didn't make any special arrangement. And I've never known a more wonderful audience.
Michael Dean on Late Night Lineup.
What kind of poetry, if I can get back to it, did the prisoners respond to? As you would appreciate, this is a very special kind of audience.
Yes, well, I don't know, but I'd really know. Would you be able to
I don't think so. I think my wife did one of her ordinary programmes with Walter de la Mare, but I think you also did
Trampwoman's Tragedy, I may have done.
Yes. No, the Tennyson, dear.
Lady of Shalott.
Lady of Shalott.
Oh, they did like
yes,
that.
They did like
yes,
that.
They did
they
really.
liked the romance.
Yes, it was.
I'm sure you did McCavity.
I did McCavity.
McCavity, the mystery cat. Well, that did go down quite well.
McCavity is a mystery cat. He's called the Hidden Paw, for he's the master criminal who can defy the law. He's the bafflement of Scotland Yard, the flying squad's despair, for when they reach the scene of crime, McCavity's not there.
One of the things that I remember, especially about Margaret, was that she was a champion of the underdog, the underprivileged, wasn't she?
I think you can combine both words, underdog, underprivileged. I mean, I don't know anybody who's collected around them such a strange and odd lot of people who, in some way, she found very interesting, and she never saw them as underprivileged or anything. She saw them as people.
Listening to the archive, that was Gwen Robinson Casey Lord, one is often confronted by an apparently banal observation, which then turns out to be entirely apt. Collected around Margaret were a bizarre and fabulous collection of friends, including at one time a Jordanian prince. Margaret and Stringer entertained him for some weeks before discovering he was in truth an antique dealer from Notting Hill, just out of jail. And then was Dawn, née Dawn Langley Simmons.
Stringer and Margaret met Dawn Langley Simmons in New York, and they were drawn to unusual characters, Margaret and Stringer. They liked people who were slightly different, and Gordon was certainly that. Apparently he had a parrot on his shoulder called Marilyn that travelled with him where he went sometimes. He was obviously gay and rather flamboyant, and they became friendly with Gordon, were very generous with him, looked after him. He came and visited. And then, suddenly, out of the blue, they received a letter from him saying that he was now a woman, and he was Dawn Pepita Langley Simmons. That when he was born, he'd been born a woman, but he'd been treated like a man. He was getting married to a black man from the South, very unusual in the 60s. And whereas most people might think, oh gosh, that's a bit odd, didn't expect that, they just thought, oh well, yes, of course, why wouldn't he? And then later, Dawn had this ridiculous story that she'd given birth, which she clearly hadn't. She'd kind of bought this baby from a poor black woman. I think the father was actually the guy that she'd married. And later on, there was a book about Dawn Langley Simmons which divulged the truth and found out that a lot of what she'd written was a pack of lies, as indeed was a lot of the book that she'd written about Margaret, and she maintained that Margaret and Stringer had adopted him legally, which was all a load of nonsense. And some of it was based in reality and some of it was based in fantasy.
We begin with an affectionate picture of Dame Margaret Rutherford, one of our most popular character actresses, until her death in 1972 when she was 80. This autumn, a book about her life is due to be published in America. It's called Mother Rutherford, A Blithe Spirit, and it's written by Dawn Langley Simmons, who was adopted by Margaret Rutherford and her actor husband Stringer Davis.
This is 1979, and the legitimacy or otherwise of this adoption is not as yet in question.
Now, Mrs. Simmons herself has had a pretty eventful life. She was once known as Gordon Langley Hall and underwent an operation to change her sex. Then, as a woman, contracted the first legal marriage to a Negro in the state of South Carolina. Well, a short time ago, when Dawn Langley Simmons was in this country, I asked her how she and the actress that she always called Mother Rutherford had first met each other.
Mother Rutherford and Father Stringer, as they later became, had married very late in life. She was 52, and they had no children. And so, in her own words, they decided to adopt from the heart. And Mother Rutherford had been reading my first book, which was called Me Papoose Sitter. She had been reading it while riding across London on a double-decker bus. And she said that I became so invigorated that I didn't realize that the bus had driven with me into the depot. And she decided that I had to be one of the adoptive children. So when they came to New York City, that's how we met.
What was your reaction to being adopted in that way?
Well, I loved it because I had had rather a sad childhood, and I had been very much alone since then.
Did you feel immediately part of a family?
Absolutely. I mean, when one was embraced in those large Rutherfordish arms, and with dear Father Stringer smiling in the background and calling you dear heart and things like that, well, I was wanted, really wanted.
She wasn't always in herself, one gathers, an enormously happy woman, and indeed suffered from time to time from nervous breakdowns. Was it hard for her to make herself funny and amusing and eccentric in her parts when behind that Margaret Rutherford, the Margaret Rutherford we knew as an artist, there was this sadder person?
Yes, I think so. And I think that's why she had such compassion and sympathy for what happened to me.
Yes, how did she take to your transformation from a man to a woman?
Well, you see, she had known the circumstances, and she apparently, I didn't know this 2 days ago, she had told the Vicar of Hastings, the Reverend Tom Savins, and his good wife Margaret, that Dawn needs all the support that I can give her, and I'm going to give her that support.
One cannot dismiss Dawn Langley Simmons' account of her own life entirely, and she remains an intriguing figure in the history of gender reassignment surgery and transgender culture.
She was a very maternal person, Margaret. I think it was probably a shame that she didn't have children, and there were a number of reasons for that. She was very worried that she might hand on any mental illness to offspring. And she married late. I mean, she met Stringer, and there was a long, long engagement for years, part of which was because of Stringer's mother.
Here is a happy couple interviewed in 1966.
Is it difficult, Miss Rutherford, being married to an actor? Perhaps I should ask Stringer Davis that.
Who are you going to ask?
I'll ask your husband.
That's your question.
Sorry, I haven't. Is it difficult?
With both of you involved in the same career?
No, I don't think so. I've been a supporting actor all my working life since 1920, and I really didn't see why I shouldn't support a star off stage as well as on stage.
And my side of that question is that without this particular support, I couldn't have done what I have done. So for me, it's a sine qua non to have him at my side.
She was certainly very devoted to him, and he to her. I don't think sex reared its head very much, somehow. She was capable of a great deal of love. But after all, sex and love are not the same.
A little of that chasteness lingers over the on-screen partnerships of Margaret Rutherford. Amongst the maiden aunts and elderly spinsters she often played were a handful of doughty women who were, to all intents and purposes, married to their profession.
Seldom has the cinema united so many outstanding talents in a single motion picture. Here is the scintillating, immaculate wit of Oscar Wilde, brilliantly captured on the screen by the artistry of Anthony Asquith and a distinguished cast of stars. Michael Dennison is the gay, disarming Algernon Moncrief, and Margaret Rutherford, the preposterous Miss Prism.
You?
Yes.
Mama. Mr. Worthing, I am unmarried.
Lord. John Gielgud, who directed Margaret on stage in The Importance of Being Earnest, referred to her as a sweet and naive woman.
I mean, Margaret was a real outdoors type. You know, people used to say that when they'd go to a dressing room, it was in February and all the windows were open. She was always walks everywhere at a great pace. And she was a great swimmer. There's a great story with Anthony Worrell Thompson. His grandmother was a friend of Margaret's. And Margaret taught Anthony how to swim. And he said they would go off into the Thames and she would dive in wearing these most ridiculous, billowing swimming costume, jumping off boats while other pleasure seekers on the Thames would look and gasp and take photographs.
It was November, and it was very cold, and she was very depressed. In the middle of breakfast, she said, "Oh, dear heart, I would love to do something today." And I said, "What, Margaret?" She said, "Could we go swimming? I need air, I need I need some freedom." Well, the Gerrard's Cross baths did open up. This was the last day the water was in them. And she took a bathing costume, and we got there. And I said, "Margaret, the terrible thing is I can't go swimming with you because I haven't got a bathing costume." She said, "Oh, no, darling, we'll get that fixed." She called over one of the men, and they had a child's bathing costume. She said, "Out into the middle, darling, take me out into the middle," because I had to life-save her. And she was banging me on the side under the water to go further. And I thought, I can imagine the story. I drowned Margaret Rutherford. Finally, we got back to the bank, and she heaved herself out, and she said, "Now I can face life again." And she was oblivious of everything except that she'd breathed and she'd felt the cool water, and she'd done something on the sad day.
The tricky periods increased as Margaret got older. Her final West End appearance was in Sheridan's The Rivals. It was Richard Sheridan's father, Thomas, of course, who had been the architect of the elocution courses she had mastered years before. She could no longer rely on them to get her through a performance.
The Rivals was torture. I went to the first night. I always went to her first nights. And always before, when she came on, the whole stage lit up. And in The Rivals, it didn't. It was a tired old woman in a heavy costume. There's this very well-known speech which starts, "Observe me, Sir Anthony, I would by no means have any daughter of mine a progeny of learning." She dried in the middle. And I could feel half the house having to restrain itself from leaping up and giving her a prompt. And it was so sad, because if she'd only had it sooner, she'd have been the Mrs. Malaprop of our generation.
Like a lot of comedy actors, Margaret suffered from the most troubling of afflictions. She wanted to be taken seriously. On the whole, audiences felt the bleak house of highbrowism was not for Margaret. Friend and writer Rumer Godden was of a similar opinion.
Like a great many of us, Margaret always wanted to do what she couldn't, what she was not really good at. And that was not comedy, but serious, almost tragic plays. Her lifelong ambition was to play Elizabeth Fry.
Knowing what we do now, a Quaker prison reformer doesn't seem such a stretch. And one shouldn't forget that Margaret spent a lifetime subtly undermining stereotypes. She received an Academy Award for the VIPs. Margaret Rutherford could rummage in the handbag for a lost railway or airline ticket more amusingly than any other actress before or since.
Your films, Miss Rutherford, have always been popular here. Lately, they've been enormously successful in America. Why do you think Americans like you?
Well, I always very much wonder why people like me, actually, and I'm very glad if they do. I'm extremely grateful to America for all the affection they offer me. I can only say that it's, what's the word I was? Reciprocal.
Mm.
I love Americans, many of them, really. They are so forthright and warm-hearted. And sort of childlike, too, in a way, I think. They don't mind simple things like me.
A backhanded compliment coming from anyone other than Margaret. She maintained a childlike appreciation of nonsense and new stuff.
One popular image of you is everybody's ideal aunt, but to me you seem very, very contemporary, very modern in some respects.
Oh, that fills me with delight. You couldn't say anything nicer.
If only there'd been more of her to watch on television.
Jackanory is the storytime spot on BBC One, every weekday at 5:15. And next week's stories will be read by Margaret Rutherford. She was once described as a cross between a rabbit and an elderly, indignant hen, so it's appropriate that her readings will be from the animal stories of Beatrix Potter. But is this a new departure, reading stories for children on television?
Yes, it's the first time I've done it at all. I was terrified, really.
Why?
No, because it was a new phase of work for me. And I think television is always rather terrifying, you know.
Beatrix Potter isn't terrifying.
No, she's a most friendly person. But it was terrifying in the sense that I wanted most earnestly to do her some justice.
I take it you're a great admirer of her stories, then?
Oh, yes, I am. But this particular job has led me to know them much better. As a child, I didn't seem to be very aware of her, I'm afraid. I was too old, I suppose, for childhood, you know, then.
Mm. What she means, of course, is that when Potter's tales were first published, she was already too grown up, too old to have come across them.
But now I come to know the full value.
Of Potter, yes, and childhood.